Hello. This is the eighth or ninth part of the program on revolutions of 1989. We're talking about protest, dissolution, and bad economy in the East and West in the 1980s. This is Kevin Stoda, and this is a series on the revolutions of 1989. And again, in this segment, we're focusing on what was happening mostly in Eastern Europe in the 1980s, but also especially what was happening in Germany. One interesting thing to note is that economically speaking, the Western economies, including Japan, were not doing that well prior to the collapse of the Iron Curtain in Central Europe in 1989. For example, throughout the 6 years I lived in Germany and France during the end of the 1980s, unemployment was unusually high, similar to what these same countries face in our current global economic crisis today. Japan was getting ready to face nearly a decade and a half of recession as the revolution of 1989 rolled around in Eastern Europe. From 1986 onwards, the US Congress was forced again and again to decrease its long-term military spending due to economic hazards, including one major stock market collapse. Moreover, there was a continued lack of increase in standards of living by many Americans throughout the decade, which of course continues to this day. A lot of jobs were being outsourced for the first time so that the companies would have to pay less. This concerned are also and affected adversely social and health benefits for a great number of Americans. In the USA, under Ronald Reagan, the social welfare system afforded for 3 generations was being dismantled in the name of free market capitalism, and Western employees were getting nervous about what globalism posed for the working class majority. In short, free market capitalism as such was not showcasing nearly as much success in terms of improving the quality of life as many writers and Western historians and government leaders portrayed or pretended to be the case when they were writing about history in the 1990s and all the way up to the present. What did Eastern Europeans expect or want from what they saw in the West? Eastern Europeans, too, wanted a future for themselves and their children where they had political space to speak up when something in a society was unfair, dangerous, or too limiting. Many of those in Eastern Europe had already seen European laws getting against squatting illegally to obtain housing and undertaking illegal renting and subletting of apartments all over East Berlin. They'd observed this. They did not want to go that way, but it was also starting in Eastern Europe. Jansen describes this in detail in his book about East Germany, The Wrong Side of the Wall. Tacheles would be an example of a section of East Berlin that was taken over by people who were looking to make their own way. This was for many even more appealing than any particular new political system that many young Eastern Europeans sought or even envisioned in the run-up to the peaceful revolution of 1989. In other words, they didn't have an idea what they really wanted. They just knew they wanted change. Anecdotally, Mark Jansen, in The Wrong Side of the Week, visited a theater in East Berlin. That evening, he noted that for no obvious reason, a shopping cart had been placed to the left of the actors on stage. The play was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Jensen had wondered at the time whether the shopping cart signaled the need for much more consumer choice or some other call for opening up trade or relations with the West. Perhaps the lack of choice in a society where everyone's basic needs were taken care of leads to people feeling like they're locked up or crazy, like someone locked up in an insane asylum, like the Cuckoo's Nest. In short, on the one hand, the Western ideology of freedom of speech was appealing. On the other hand, it was the Western opportunity to choose a lifestyle which Eastern Germans saw in the West, and probably what led thousands of them to consider leaving the countries where they were born and raised in prior to November 9th, 1989. Now, let me continue to talk about There was a deconstruction of a social welfare state, not just going on in Eastern Germany, but also in Western Germany. Over the 2 decades, or 3 decades since 1989, many from Eastern Germany and their offspring have been dissatisfied with what the Western's so-called capitalist democracies have had to offer them in terms of a better life. Naturally, they did not know that all when 1989 was being experienced. Many East Germans in the wake of Tiananmen massacre in early June 1989 simply knew that they did not want their protest to end that way. They should now protest or they should flee their country. They had a choice. In a way, the world of East Germany, after decades of totalitarian excess and bad economics, had left many East Germans with a fairly simple identification of what Western freedom was. Like in the Billy McGee song, freedom is just another word for nothing else to lose. All that the masses knew before the wall crumbled was that the winds of change, or the river of history, was flowing, and they stood against the totalitarian run state economy. They were going to try to keep up with the West, but it wasn't going to work. And they had been watching this for a long time, and they wanted a smorgasbord of choices. Once the wall came down, many discontented East Germans ran faster than their peers in the church-centered protests of the 1980s. They ran faster and toppled the Honecker regime as quickly as they could after Gorbachev's visit. And the realization of the communist bigwigs that one, Russia wasn't going to bail them out became evident. And they realized that so many East Germans were ready to flee the system by then that they didn't have any very much choice in knocking the wall down themselves. Finally, these same communist leaders, this would be the third point, and followers had realized that it was their own offspring who were leading the demonstration. The Tiananmen solution was dropped as an option in October 1989 after the Gorbachev visit by those who had been supporting Honecker, and East Germany was slowly allowed to spin out of Soviet orbit. This was followed by the fall of leaders in Czechoslovakia and Romania by the end of 1989. I want to give a partial postlude. For 2 decades, the West has tried to, or 3 decades, the West has tried to embrace the run of Eastern humanity to its borders. What will the West do now that the mythical neoliberal free market system of the 2008 collapse appears to have been widely fraud? It's also caused a backlash in regions around Europe. We're talking about in Spain, Ireland, Greece, where the disappointment of the West, of the people in the West, has been great. Some have been seen some have seen disastrous changes. The attempt by the Western Germany to build a social market economy since 1949 had been embraced by many in Central Europe as a step towards an alternative path to development. It is more than likely it was the social market economy of Western Germany and the socialism of the Scandinavian countries and France which had appealed to Eastern Germans. It wasn't the cowboy capitalism of the United States or the let's go alone attitude of the UK leaders. Eastern Europeans sought and succeeded between 1990 and the creation of the European Union as we know today, to oversee many changes and reforms. It was not, though, the neoliberal shock doctrine economy forced on Chile and on Russia in the 1990s, Chile in the 70s and 90s, which most Eastern Europes rushed to join the Western market economy for, or market union. Sadly, as a fate would have it, sitting at the seat of government in Western Germany in 1989 was somewhat on the coalition of free markets who would demand that an even stronger market path be followed in subsequent decades in Germany. This would lead to a lot of privatization in Germany, including privatized universities and schools at a level never before seen. In short, over the continuing decades, Germany began to give up what had been most appealing to the East Germans. In summary, the sort of neoliberal leaders and political economists that ran Germany up through the past decades have wiped out much alternative dialogue with opposition groups from the left and even the right. Eventually, with Hartz IV and other legislative and administrative changes in Germany's welfare state, these neoliberals pushed through market reforms that Ronald Reagan, George Bush, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and others have sometimes admired. In 1980s, for example, East Germany churches had played a large role in asking for reform, but they did not ask for this neoliberal reform. In the case of East Germany, the church conducted dialogue between citizens and the government, assuming the role of speaking up for the voiceless in the former Volksrepublic or People's Republic. But church leaders and lay leaders were busy organizing also mass demonstrations, emphasizing the necessity of nonviolent protest and the virtue of following Christ's examples. This would be quite different than what we were given a view of in our history books over the last 30 years in the United States. Churches were active. They sheltered diverse activist groups, even people who were atheists and agnostic, and they articulated the ideological basis of the people's protest. The church was the main institution to provide an alternative worldview, Central Europe or Eastern Europe or Western Europe. I believe that great many of those intimately involved in change and involved in reform in East German churches in the 1980s had never anticipated a swing to the West as pulled off by the Kohl government in the early 1990s. Kohl's organization worked well with many East German latecomer protesters and newly formed parties such as the current Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, who joined Democratic Awakening only just as the wall was ready to fall. With such a swing towards radical free market liberal leadership pushing the momentum, however, East Germans were eventually bound to be dissatisfied with the results of the change that we've seen over the past 30 years. All polls these days show the vast majority of East Germans do not look on the pre-1989 period as a bad old days. It is time that the totalitarian regime of the GDR be properly studied by students today, though. Several babies were thrown out when the two Germanys joined, and the god of free market economics took over all of European economic leadership after 1989. Many of the protesters in the churches of the East who had incubated the collapse of the communist totalitarian system had hoped for an alternative or third way. However, the East German leadership elected in March 1990 thought it had been given a mandate to capitulate almost every dream of the freethinkers to cold play capitalism. Similar sort of thing happened in the United States, I would say, in my lifetime. In 2000, there was this pressure to get the Supreme Court to decide who our president would be. They all played this shock doctrine thing, just like they had with the Germans. We have to do this. Our economy will go bananas if we do not decide who's the president of the United States. And so they took it to the Supreme Court before all the votes were counted. It should have been Albert Gore. Anyway, let's go back to shock doctrine Germany, 1990. And again, in the present day. In retrospect, the hysteria and drumbeating of the political economic wonks of the 1990s in Germany, i.e. those leaders and opinion makers who were demanding Anschluss of East Germany onto West Germany, now sound all too familiar to us again in the past decade or so, especially after watching the world's largest bankers and financial firms go after governments again with such a drumbeat and mantra that the world will collapse in order to gain trillions of dollars in assistance in less than 9 months. Remember, what we're talking about is between late 2007 and early 2008, but it continued up until the present day, actually. I know some of the banks, many of the banks paid back their money, but this is the kind of cover-up that has led to continued distress and distrust of the Western form of capitalism that came to dominate Europe after the collapse of communism. The similarity of assumed global collapse, which could happen again, we need to ask, what will be the political economic system that our children and grandchildren live under? You know, talking about global warming, we're talking about population chaos as people immigrate and look for jobs. People flee from wars and famine and lack of water. Shouldn't we be demanding appropriate changes to the whole system? In fact, so that the Western, Central, and Eastern European peoples also need to stop this tyranny of the present, and also those in Russia need to do the same. Part of the rebuilding work that is required includes, one, honestly looking at the best and worst aspects of the market and social markets, and two, learning from what has really worked well and poorly, what has worked poorly in the past. For example, East Germany's commitment to women and children, childcare, was much better in many ways than what West Germany had to offer in 1990, and since then too. The same is true in most of the Eastern Europe in terms of what's happened in the post-communist era. There were many state youth programs, education and training programs. They were varied throughout the East, and they were taken away because of financial or propaganda saying they were all state manipulation of individuals, and they were gotten rid of. Third, a proper view needs to be made of the future and what it can use and what we cannot do. We cannot have tunnel vision. We cannot continue the neoliberal approach that's going to make it easy for fascists to take the whole system. To reduce this tunnel vision, I would suggest that in the years leading up to the collapse of communism, that we must study those. In other words, can any of the babies that we threw out with the rest of the bathwater with the takeover of Germany in 1990 be rescued and implemented where they serve people and society better than the current system? The same question could be asked in Czechoslovakia, which became Czech Republic, and Slovakia, in the former Yugoslavia, and all the way to Siberia. In other words, can any of the babies be recovered? If not, what can we build that would do a better job? In the meantime, I suggest you guys ask Dr. Professor Mark Jansen for his copy of The Wrong Side of the Wall in America and East Berlin during the time of the Peaceful Revolution. I've read the book 3 or 4 times. It'll give you a lot more insight than I did about Europe. I also ask that you see the other parts of the Revolution series that I presented. And if you have any questions, let's talk either tomorrow night or the next night. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy the program and this YouTube channel. Get educated, learn about history, and pass it on to others. Thank you for listening.